The train station was small, almost forgotten by time, surrounded by old stone buildings and a light fog that began to rise with the end of the afternoon. It was autumn, and the brown leaves danced in the wind, scattering across the paths, as if they knew that there, at that very moment, something was about to happen, something that fate itself had secretly whispered to the universe. Her name was Emilia. He came from a coastal city, from a strict family, raised among traditions and expectations. That always seemed bigger than his own dreams. Her eyes had an indefinable tone between amber and honey, and there was a silent restlessness in them, like someone looking for something without knowing what exactly. His name was Tomas. He lived in a rural village a few hours away, working in the carpentry shop with his father. Simple, reserved, with a kind of look that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. He was the kind of person who rarely spoke about himself, but whose silences carried depths that many would never realize. He wasn't there to board. He had just come to deliver a package to the neighboring city and, by chance, or by some force majeure, decided to stop for a few minutes at the station. The first exchange of glances was brief, almost unnoticed. She was waiting for the train that would take her to the capital, where she would start a new university course. He watched the movement around, taking his time. When their eyes met for the second time, something inside them both fell silent. It wasn't one of those instantaneous loves, full of euphoria. It was something rarer, a serene connection, as if both recognized in the other a forgotten memory of something they never experienced. He walked up to her without thinking, and it was like that, without big words, without formal introductions, that they began to talk. They talked about books, the wind, how the leaves seemed to move like little goodbyes. They talked about the city, their childhood, their dreams that had not yet been lived. The conversation flowed with a strange lightness, as if there were years of friendship stitching together that moment. Time, that man who always pushes us forward, seemed to hesitate, granting the two a rare interval of eternity. When the train arrived, Emilia stood. He hesitated. Her gaze searched for something, perhaps confirmation that what she felt was real. Tomas also remained silent, holding in his hands the desire to say something that still had no name. But instead of words, he gave her a small notebook. "It's where I write my ideas for what I still don't understand," he said, almost as an apology for not knowing how to name what they had experienced there. She smiled. It wasn't just any smile. It was the kind of smile that seals an invisible pact of reunion, of hope, of something that goes beyond the now. She took the notebook, holding it as if keeping a precious secret. "So, before getting on the train, he just said, 'Write to me. Even if I don't answer, even if I never read it, write.'" The train left, leaving behind a trail of smoke and absence. Tomas remained there for a long time, with his hands in his pockets and his heart filled with a new emptiness, the kind that only appears when the soul recognizes something it doesn't want to lose. That day, neither of them could imagine what the future would hold. The world had not yet broken into wars. There were not yet irreversible silences. There were not yet letters stained by time. That afternoon, everything was seed. And although the distance planted kilometers between them and life created labyrinths, there, that almost forgotten season, something had been born that not even time would be able to erase. They did not exchange promises. They did not arrange reunions. They didn't say, "I'll be back" or "wait for me." But one letter, just one, was yet to come. A letter that, one day, would cross decades, borders and silences, to sew together what fate tried to undo. The weeks that followed the meeting at the station were, for Emilia, strangely silent. The big city was noisy, full of news, faces and opportunities, but nothing filled that exact corner of the chest where Tomas's name was now, stored like a whisper. She opened the notebook he had given her the first night in her new room. The cover was already beginning to fold at the edges, and on the first few pages there were only loose words, scribbles, incomplete ideas, as if each line was looking for something or someone. It was as if she were reading unfinished thoughts, written for a time that had not yet arrived. There, between one note and another, she found him again, and I missed a silence that I had never had before with anyone else. Without them agreeing, the exchange of letters began. She wrote the first one. I didn't know if he would respond. I didn't even know if he was still thinking about her. But I needed to write. I needed to try, even if the paper came back empty. He talked about how classes were going, described the city, talked about a bookstore hidden in the old center where he had found a blue-covered book that said a lot of what he felt. There was no confession, no promises, just the sweetness between the lines. Tomas received the letter weeks later. When he read it, he felt as if the ground beneath his feet had stopped shaking. She remembered him. I thought about him. And he wrote. That night he couldn't sleep. He answered carefully, choosing each word, as if it were a seed. He told about working in the workshop, about the old radio that always failed on rainy nights, and about a flower that had grown alone between the station tracks, like an omen. The letters became a refuge, amid the demands of adulthood, family responsibilities, and imposed expectations. Those pages were the only place where they could both be fully who they were. No masks, no fear, without the weight of judgments. They wrote a parallel story, made of raw honesty, sweet longing, and words that touched where touch cannot reach. Nobody knew, not her parents, not his friends. It was a love that was born in the shadow of the world, protected not by walls, but by distance and silence. A secret that didn't need to be hidden out of shame, but out of preciousness. As if it were something too sacred to be exposed to the noise of routine, in the eyes of those who wouldn't understand. Emilia started visiting the station whenever she returned to her hometown, even when she knew he wouldn't be there. She sat on the same wooden bench where she had met him, felt the wind in her hair, and closed her eyes, as if she could recreate that moment. Sometimes he would leave a note under the loose rock beside the trail, a sentence, a drawing, a loose thought. Tomas, in turn, learned to recognize her handwriting from afar. The postman already knew that when he delivered an envelope with that delicate handwriting, it was best to leave it and go without saying anything, because Tomas stopped the world to read it. In the letters, they invented meetings that never happened, a picnic on the banks of a non-existent river, a starry night in a random field, a dance in the middle of a deserted street in the rain. They created places that only existed there, in words, and in these places, they could love each other freely. They could hug each other, say everything they didn't have the courage to say, even to themselves. It was a love without a body, but with a soul, a love that flourished, even if far from the light of day. Emilia began to store each letter in a wooden box under the bed. Sometimes I reread them all at once, crying softly over something that hurt and comforted at the same time. Tomas did the same, but in absolute secrecy. He hid the letters inside an old book, which was kept behind other books, like a camouflaged reliquary on the workshop shelf. This wasn't just an exchange of correspondence. It was a confession. It was shelter. And over time, even without a physical meeting, they became an essential part of each other. Because there are loves that don't need daily presence. They just needed a bridge, and theirs was made of paper, ink, and real feeling. The world around it followed its course. The seasons changed, war approached, life called with its urgency. But between them, there was a parallel time, suspended on paper. A time where love not only survived, it flourished, in secret, in silence, and deeply real. The following autumn didn't just bring cold, it also brought fear. The leaves fell again, as if repeating the cycle of beauty before the end. But this time, there was something different in the air. Newspapers began to carry increasingly frequent headlines about military movements, international tensions, and a climate of urgency that could no longer be ignored. At first, they seemed like rumors, distant exaggerations, but little by little, the whispers turned to screams, and the screams reached Tomas's village. The call to war came as a letter, ironically, a dry, brown envelope with an official stamp. He received it late one afternoon while sanding a piece of wood for a commissioned chair. He stopped what he was doing when he saw the seal, read the name printed in bold at the top of the sheet, and felt a lump form in his throat. His name was there. He had been summoned. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. It just stood still, in silence. The kind of silence that precedes big changes. After a while, he washed his face, sat down at the table and began to write. The recipient was, of course, Emilia. But this letter was different from all the others. He didn't try to be poetic or hide the pain between the lines. It was direct, said he was going, that I didn't know where, exactly, or for how long. And, most difficult of all, I didn't know if I would come back. He confessed fear, uncertainty, and love. Yes, this time, he wrote it bluntly. He said he loved it. Who loved like he never thought it was possible? To love someone, and if he didn't come back, He wanted her to know that. Emilia received the letter 2 days later. When he read it, time stopped. The noise from the street, the footsteps in the building's hallway, the clinking of cups in the cafe on the corner, everything dissolved into silence. His hands were shaking. The letter fell into his lap, then returned to his hands, then fell again. She couldn't finish it in one sitting. I stopped, cried, came back. The chest seemed too small for so much compressed feeling. She tried to respond that same night, but her hand wouldn't obey, as if any word he wrote was insufficient. After all, what do you say to someone who is going to war? What do you write to the man you love when death is already signed between the lines of farewell? The next day, Emilia decided to travel. I needed to see him, but the trains were crowded, late, the roads blocked by military inspections. I spent days trying to find him, until I learned, from an acquaintance in the city, that Tomas had already left. The troop had left the previous dawn. She had arrived too late. The station, the same one where they first saw each other, now seemed like another place. The walls had recruitment posters. The bench where they had spoken was empty, dirty, abandoned. But Emilia sat there anyway. She stayed for hours, with his letter in her hands, folded and reread until the corners fell apart. It was there that she wrote her response. She used the notebook he had given her. With the pen shaking between his fingers, he wrote, like someone fighting against time, said she loved him, who loved him from the first look, that each letter had been a breath of life, and that I would wait for him. It didn't matter how long, nor under what conditions. I just needed him to come back. She ended the letter with a request: don't stop writing, even if they don't reach me, even if the world collapses. Write, because your words keep me alive. But fate, which had so often smiled silently on that love, now seemed to turn its face away. The letter was sent, but the paths were changed. Borders had become walls, and the mail became a rare miracle. No one knew if the mail reached the front. Nobody knew where Tomas was. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months, and silence began to creep in between the gaps of hope. Tomas, in turn, kept her last letter with him, the one he had written before the draft, folded like a relic in his uniform pocket. I read whenever I could, sometimes in the middle of the night, in the flickering light of the flashlight, others leaning against a tree, with the distant sound of explosions piercing the sky. And he wrote, whenever I could, even without knowing if she would receive it, even without knowing if there would be a tomorrow. Because when life loses ground, only what remains is what cannot be destroyed. The love written, the love spoken, the love that resists even when everything seems to fall apart. And that's how the war came. Like a thief, stealing hugs, stealing time, but leaving behind a thread, thin, fragile, but still firm, between two hearts that had never given up on each other. War has a strange talent for silencing even the most urgent feelings. At the front, among the mud, the cold, and the constant threat of death, Tomas learned to survive. Every day was a silent victory, every sunrise a temporary miracle. But what hurt most, even more than the shrapnel, was the absence of his words, not his, those he kept writing, but hers. Emilia, not knowing if she had received her farewell letter, not knowing if his declaration of love, finally written, had crossed the distance and found shelter in his chest. Tomas wrote like someone who builds invisible bridges, letters stained with dirt, ink smudged by the rain, pages folded between the pages of a diary that he hid under his makeshift pillow. He told everything: the biting cold, the companions who left in silence, the smell of smoke that never left his clothes, and the dreams that still kept him standing. But mostly he wrote about her, about the sound of her voice, which he no longer remembered exactly, about the light smile, about the first touch, about the station bench. He recreated everything in words, like someone trying to save from oblivion what time insists on erasing. But these letters, one by one, accumulated. No one knew if they were being delivered. War mail was fickle. Censors cut out entire sections, and sometimes bags of mail never arrived. A restless question grew in her soul. Does she think of me? And one even more painful, does she know how much I love her? Because there was so much he never said. He never had time to say that. On stormy nights, he relived the afternoon when she held the notebook with both hands. He never said that when the world seemed about to explode. All he had to do was remember the way she wrote his name calmly, like someone saying a prayer, and he would find strength. He never said that, Even among 1,000 voices, it was hers that he was looking for in the silence. And while he wrote, she waited. Emilia now lived between clocks that didn't tick and days that didn't pass. Every morning, I looked at the mailbox as if looking for one last hope, but nothing arrived. There was no answer. There was no signal. People around her began to tell her to move on, to forget, not to harbor illusions. They said that war was a machine for making widows without alliances, and that she needed to think about real life. But true love does not obey logic or time. And, in silence, she resisted. I read old letters, slept with his notebook next to my pillow, and wrote pages that I never sent. Because there was no address. Because no one knew where Tomas was. Because maybe, and just maybe, he was no longer anywhere. And it was in this time of silence and absence that the unspoken words began to scream. She never said that she loved him too from day one. That his life had been divided between before and after that bench at the station. She never said that. When she wrote her letters, she felt like she was touching a part of herself that she didn't even know existed before. She never revealed that, even surrounded by people, she felt alone without him. Those words, swallowed by distance and pain, became a weight she carried in her chest. There were letters that didn't come out, sentences that got stuck, feelings that never reached their destination. She thought, what if he dies without knowing? He thought, what if I die without hearing from her? It was in this abyss between what was said and what was trapped that their love endured. Because, in some mysterious way, they both felt it. Even without answers, even without confirmation, there was a hidden certainty, an invisible link that kept them connected. But time does not wait for indecisive lovers, nor does it forgive postponed silences. A new bombardment was approaching, and a new change in the course of the war would cause Tomas to be transferred to an even more dangerous mission. He knew he might not come back, and then, that night, he wrote his longest letter. It was a farewell, a confession, a supplication. He said everything he had never said. He reviewed every detail of what he lived with her. He apologized for the saved words. And he wrote, if something happens to me, know that you were the reason for my courage. The love that we don't fully live, I lived inside. Every day, he sealed the letter. He handed it to the nearest companion, said, if I don't come back, give this to her, and he left. On the other side, Emilia was writing her own letter, one that I also didn't know would arrive. And at the end, with tears falling onto the paper, she wrote, if one day you read this, and I'm no longer here, know that I loved you in silence. But every beat of my heart screamed your name, 2 hearts, 2 letters, and a destiny that, once again, seemed to play. With time, the end of the war came as a mixture of relief and disorientation. Men returned home with worn-out looks. Cities were rebuilt. Flags waved like promises of a new beginning. But for many, including Emilia, the end of the conflict did not bring peace. It brought silence. There was no news from Tomas. His name was not on the death lists, not even those of the survivors. It was as if he had disappeared into the wind, carried away by a gust of dust in some forgotten field. Emilia visited hospitals, wrote to military bodies, tried to cross-reference names, dates, battles, but all he found were uncertainties. Time passed, the years began to take their toll. Youth turned into maturity, and life, the one that insists on continuing, forced her to follow. But following is not the same as forgetting. Emilia got married. His name was Arturo, a good, calm, kind man. He met her at the library where she started working and was immediately enchanted. He knew there were shadows in her eyes, but he decided to love her anyway. He never asked many questions. It was as if he sensed that certain pains can't be cured. They just settled deep in the soul, and all he could do was build, alongside it, something that was worthy, even if it wasn't complete. They had a daughter, Clara, and it was Clara who gave new meaning to Emilia's world. The girl grew up with her mother's eyes and the curiosity of someone who feels that there are untold stories roaming the corridors of the house. And there was because even though Emilia smiled in the photos, even though she cooked with dedication and read bedtime stories to her daughter, there was a part of her that lived in another time, on a station bench, in folded letters, in a name that had never been said out loud again. Under the bed, a box. Inside it, the notebook that Tomas had given him, the letters they exchanged, and the last one, the one that Emilia wrote without knowing if he was still alive. She never knew if she arrived. but he never managed to throw it away, because, somewhere in his heart, he still hoped. Time passed. The daughter grew up, got married, had children. Emilia became a grandmother. The wrinkles came, the hair turned white, but the shine in the eyes remained the same, that contained shine, like a light saved for someone who never returned. Arturo fell ill, and on his last night, he took Emilia's hand and said, "I know you've always loved someone else, but thank you for letting me love you anyway." She cried. She cried for him, for herself, and for Tomas, who might never have the chance to hear something like that. Tomas's life, on the other hand, had followed a completely different path. He survived. He was reported missing in action, but had been captured and held as a prisoner on an enemy base. Years in silence, without being able to write, without receiving answers, without knowing if the world still remembered him. When he was finally released, he was already a different man. He carried an abyss in his eyes and on his body, scars that went beyond the skin. He returned home, found the village almost the same, but everything was different. His parents had passed away. The workshop no longer existed. The station bench was still there, but now covered in moss and leaves. And about Emilia, nothing. Nobody knew. The letters he wrote were never delivered. And when he found his own abandoned house, he understood. Time waits for no one. Tomas decided to leave. She went to live in another city, working with the little she knew. He became a carpenter, as before, but quieter, more reclusive. Never married. He never talked about her. The letters that Emilia sent him, only to manage to reach him years later, by a twist of fate, were kept in a worn envelope, which he kept next to a faded portrait he had made of her, from memory. Both moved on with their lives. They lived decades separated by a war that had already ended on paper, but still claimed victims in their hearts, and, even far away, even without news, even surrounded by other people, there was a silent certainty within each of them, the love they experienced, even if for a short time, even if between letters and silences, was real. It was whole, and he was alive, because life goes on, yes, but true love, love remains. He doesn't need to be fed every day, nor remembered in words. He survives between the lines. It hides in automatic gestures, in small choices, in sighs before bed. He remains in the eyes, even when the world has forgotten the name. He survives. And while the world turned, while time swept calendars, Tomas and Emilia, in silence and in different places, still kept within themselves the part of each other that was never lost. Decades had passed. Emilia was already walking with slow steps, her hair white like the silence that imposed itself between her and the past. The city had changed. The faces around were different, and the bench at the old station, although it still existed, was now more an ornament of time than a meeting place. It was on an ordinary afternoon that everything began to change. Clara, her daughter, was renovating her grandparents' old house. Among the stored boxes and furniture there was a wooden chest forgotten in the attic. Inside, in addition to old photos, musty books, and objects without a clear owner, there was a smaller box, sealed with a string, and inside the box, a letter. The envelope was yellowed, with the name Emilia written by hand, in a script that seemed to resist time. Clara didn't recognize it. He thought it was something from his grandfather. But, when he handed it to his mother, he saw something change in her eyes. Time stopped. Emilia's hands shook. She held the envelope like someone holding a ghost. I knew it before I even opened it. It was his. From Tomas. The letter, probably written in the last days of the war, had been lost. Lost. Forgotten in some postal office. Filed as an undelivered item. But there. She was alive. Stuck in time. As if he had waited all that time to arrive at exactly that moment. With her heart racing, Emilia sat up. He opened it carefully, like someone opening a wound and a longing at the same time. "Emilia," said the first line, "if this letter reaches you, it is because, somehow, against all odds, fate wanted my words to touch your eyes once again." He told how he had been captured, how he had barely survived. He spoke of fear, of darkness, of time that seemed eternal. But the center of the letter was love. The love that had resisted, the love he felt, even when he no longer knew if she was still alive. He wrote with urgency, with his soul in every line. And then, at the end of the letter, the sentence that would make Emilia collapse: "I'll be back, even if just to see you from afar, just to know if you followed, if you were happy. I need to know that you are okay, she cried. He cried like he hadn't cried in years, because there was the answer that never came. There was her love. There was the man she had waited for and who, she now knew, had also waited for her. The letter should not have arrived, but it arrived at the right time, or too late. That answer was yet to come. That night, Emilia didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair in her room, with the letter in her hands, rereading each line under the soft light of the lamp. With each word, his mind recreated the image of Tomas, his eyes, his deep and sweet voice, his shy way of smiling. What would it be like now? Would he have aged like her? Would he still be alive? Had I built another life? Or was he, at that moment, buried in some forgotten corner of the world? The letter did not say where he was, just that he would come back, that I would try to see her from afar. But there was never an appearance, no clue, no mysterious figure on the street. Did he come? Did he see her and leave? That letter, that single letter, broke the timeline. It was as if a crack had opened in the present, allowing the past to spill over everything again. Every memory, every silence, every previous letter now took on new meaning. Emilia started searching. It was as if, upon reading those words, something inside her had awakened from a very long sleep. He wrote to public agencies, looked for old files of ex-combatants, and even went to the city where Tomas lived, as he vaguely remembered from an old letter. And it was there, in a modest nursing home on the outskirts of the village, that he found his first real clue. There was a man, they said, who spoke little. His name was Tomas. He was a carpenter. He lived alone, without a family, and he kept a box full of old letters, letters that no one has ever read. Emilia's heart skipped a beat. She went to the place, trembling, leaning on her daughter's arm. She crossed the halls of the asylum to a door where a handwritten name fluttered on a laminated card. Thomas V. She knocked from the other side. An aged but firm voice replied, "Come in." When Toma's eyes met hers, time didn't just stop. It was torn. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. Both were different. Wrinkles had arrived. Hair had turned silver. Bodies were more fragile. But the eyes were the same. For a moment, neither of them said anything, until Tomas, with a choked voice, murmured, "I thought you never read that letter." She approached. He sat down next to him, and with silent tears flowing, he replied, "I read it. Now, and in that now, there was the weight of a lifetime. One now that took 40 years to happen, a now that broke time, defied logic and stitched together to souls that never stopped loving each other. The letter had done the impossible. She had returned from the past to unite to hearts that fate separated. But love never accepted being forgotten. After that lost letter that finally arrived, Emilia felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, restlessness. But it wasn't the kind of restlessness that bothers you. It was the kind that wakes you up, shakes you up, gives meaning to your steps again. The letter was an answer, yes, but it was also a question. And the only way to answer it would be to meet Tomas again. She spent weeks reliving every detail. She went through his old letters, rereading not only what he said, but what he might have tried to hide. Every city mentioned, every name, every reference. Where could he be? Did he really come back? Or had the promise he made, to see her from afar, never been fulfilled? Clara, noticing her mother's transformation, decided to help her. Together, they began searching archives of war veterans, visiting associations, getting in touch with old colleagues who, in some way, might have a clue about Tomas. It was like looking for a shadow, but Emilia didn't give up. She had already learned that true love requires no explanation, it requires presence. And even after so long, I wanted to find the truth. The search took them through forgotten roads, sleepy villages, dusty archives, and suspicious eyes. Some laughed after so many years. "Do you still believe you will find him?" But she just smiled and said, "It's not about believing, it's about continuing." In one of these searches, in a rural town where a small nursing home operated, they found a familiar name. Not exactly the same, but close enough to awaken the premonition. Tomas V. That was how he signed the letters. And the strangest thing, he had arrived at the place just over a year ago, coming from another village, with very little documentation and no registered family. Emilia's heart quickened. It wasn't certain, but it was more than she had had in 40 years. They left the same day. The road seemed longer than it was. In the car seat, Emilia held the letter with trembling hands. as if preparing to read the ending of a book whose last page had been torn out. And there he was, not in books, not in memories, not in words, but alive. When Tomas saw her, he didn't say anything. His eyes stayed locked on hers, like someone looking at a photograph they thought they had lost forever. For an instant, the entire world fell silent. There were no nurses, no walls, no windows, just two looks recognizing each other across the decades. He was thinner, hands marked by time, completely white hair, but his eyes still carried the same sweet silence of someone who always said more with their eyes than with words. And Emilia, even with the years on her face, maintained the same serenity that had enchanted him at the station. Only now, there was tiredness and also a peace that only those who have lived a long time carry. She approached. She touched his hand gently. It was real. "You came," he whispered. "You waited for me," she replied. And at that moment, everything that remained unsaid finally seemed to be heard. They talked for hours, between pauses and tears, between clasped hands and contained sighs. They reconstructed the history that the war destroyed. Tomas told her everything: the prison, the release, the fear of returning and not finding her, the decision not to interfere in the life she might have built. He said he tried to see her, yes, but when he realized that she was married, with a young daughter in her arms, he decided to disappear. I thought I had lost, but he never forgot. Emilia listened to him in silence, and then he told his part. He said he never forgot it, that I always knew something was missing. That, even with the family, with the years, with the forced smiles, the love for him was a flame that never went out. It was just protected. The hands were shaking, but love, that was firm. But Tomas' body was no longer strong. The emotion tired him. "I needed rest," they said, but he didn't want to sleep. "I was afraid of closing my eyes and losing what I had finally found again." That night, Emilia decided to stay in the asylum. She sat next to his bed, holding his hand. They were silent. And at a certain point, Tomas, with his eyes already closing, whispered, "Will you forgive me for not coming back sooner?" She kissed his forehead. "You're back, and that's all." He smiled, a light smile, like that of someone who has finally found their place in the world. The next morning, Tomas didn't wake up. He left while he slept, with your heart at peace, with her hand still holding yours. No pain, no fear, with everything I needed to go. Love. Emilia didn't cry. Right away, she sat there, silently, looking at him, because I knew that somehow, even at that end, there was a beginning. One last letter, finally delivered. A love, finally found again. After Tomas's simple wake, where only Emilia, Clara, and 2 nursing home staff were present, there was only silence. But within him, there was still something to be discovered. While organizing the few belongings that Tomas had left behind, Emilia found a small wooden box, carefully sealed. It was light, but it contained what weighed more than gold. All of her letters, yes, all, even the ones she believed had never been delivered. All there, read, reread, folded with precision, like relics. But what caught the most attention was a separate envelope, hidden under the lid of the box. It was different, closed with a small, already broken wax seal, dated 1946, and on it, written in Tomas' firm handwriting, a sentence: "If I don't come back, give it to her." It was the letter he wrote before leaving for the final mission of the war, the one he left in the hands of a companion, what should have been his last message. But she never arrived, until now. Emilia opened it carefully, and as he read, he felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. "My dear Emilia, if you're reading this, it's because something happened. Maybe I didn't come back. Maybe fate denied me the chance to look at you one more time. But if these words survive me, then please listen with your heart to what my mouth did not have time to say. I loved you. I loved you the first second I saw your eyes. I loved you in every letter of your letters. I loved you on cold mornings and combat nights. I loved you in silence, when I could no longer scream. And I loved you waiting, even when everything around me was falling apart. If I don't come back, don't cry for me. Alive, love, be happy. I won't be by your side, but I will be inside you, because loving you was the most vivid thing that ever happened to me." Tomas's words weren't just a farewell, they were a blessing. And in that instant, Emilia understood everything. Why didn't he show up? Why he never looked for her again? He had accepted death. He had said goodbye, still young, with his heart on fire and his entire soul in his hands. She cried like she hadn't cried in a long time, not from pain, but completely of liberation. The letter revealed a love that had no strings attached, a love that didn't ask for possession, a love that wanted freedom for the other, even at the cost of absence. It was, finally, the answer she never knew she was waiting for. After reading that last letter, the world was no longer the same for Emilia. Everything she had experienced, the days of waiting, her marriage to Arturo, Clara's birth, the silences, the absences, all those chapters now took on another meaning. For many years, she believed she had lost Tomas. That fate, cruel and blind, had separated them. But now she knew they were never apart, because loving someone with that depth is not something that time can erase. It's something that time changes. Every morning she woke up with a tight chest without knowing why. Every dream in which Tomas appeared as a shadow, as a memory, or as a silent presence. Every tear that flowed without explanation when reading an old book or returning to the station out of habit. Now, everything made sense. It wasn't a loose longing, it was a living connection. Even Arturo, her late husband, now appeared in a new light. Because loving Tomas never stopped her from building something real and worthy with Arturo. But understanding Tomas' love and knowing that he freed her to live made everything lighter. There was no blame, there was understanding. Clara, upon hearing the full story, cried in silence, and in that cry, there was something that Emilia had never seen in her daughter's eyes, deep admiration, because, more than a love story, it was a testimony of faith. Faith that what is true endures. Faith that, even if life pushes lovers to opposite sides, love, if it's real, always finds a way to remain. Emilia returned to the station where it all began. This time, she was alone. The bench was still there. Time had worn down the wood. Dry leaves covered the ground, but the wind still blew the same way. She sat down with the letter on her lap, closed her eyes and imagined Tomas beside her, as if he were that young man with the thick coat and the deep gaze, looking at her for the first time. But she didn't cry, just smiled, because now the past was no longer a wound. It was a garden cultivated with words, watered with silence, protected by distance and blossomed at the right time. She understood that the love she experienced with Tomas was never in vain. It shaped who she was, it fed his soul, and now, at the end, it became a legacy. Not a lost love, but a complete love. True loves don't end, they don't die. They do not fall apart over time. They wait, not on the corners, not on calendars, but in the soul. That was what Emilia carried inside her when she returned home with Tomas's letter tucked away in her chest, not as an end, but as a renewal. Because love, in her case, was never just a youthful experience. It was a vocation. For years, she believed that love had been ripped from her hands by chance, by distance, by war. But now he understood. He had just waited, waiting for the right time to bloom again, waiting for the silence to mature, waiting for the reunion to happen. Tomas lived his life on the edge of the world, but he had never been a man without direction. His compass was always the love he felt. And no matter how much time had hurt him, no matter how discreet and lonely his life had become, he did not become bitter. He didn't close his heart. He waited. Emilia also lived. He also built. He also laughed. He also cried. And yet, she never gave up on the memory that sustained her. Yes, she kept it. He guarded his love like a flame in a lamp, protected from the wind, from carelessness, from haste. Because deep down, even without knowing it, she was hoping to, and it was this waiting, patient, painful, silent, that meant that, when they met again, there was no demand. There was no "why didn't you come sooner?" There was only the certainty that their love survived everything, including time. This kind of love is not in commercial romances, nor in easy songs. It's in the small gestures, in the silence of those who write, even without a response, in the faith of someone who keeps a letter without knowing if it will be read, in the eyes of someone who recognizes the other even after 4 decades. It's the kind of love that doesn't require proof. He is the proof. Therefore, when Emilia told her story, now with courage, with clarity, with serenity, she did so not to dramatize or romanticize the pain, but to remember that yes, true love still exists, and that he can be silent. It may be asleep, but it's never dead. He just waits. A few months after Tomas' death, Emilia did something she never thought she would do. She wrote a new letter, but this time it wasn't for him. It was for Clara, and for Clara's children, and for all those who, one day, might hear your story. One last letter, not farewell, but in passing. An inheritance, a legacy. She sat at her old desk, with Tomas' letters around her, with the original notebook in her hands, and wrote with the steady hand of someone who was no longer in a hurry. Dear Clara, if you're reading this, it's because time has already taken what it should have from me. But don't be scared, because today I write with my heart at peace. There was a story I never told you in full, not out of fear, but out of protection. Now, I leave you this story as a gift, a story that was born before you, but that, in some way, is also yours. Love is a risk. Sometimes life forces us to choose paths that take us away from those we love most, but true love, it survives. Tomas loved me in a way that shaped me. Even without being by my side, he was inside me. In every choice, in every word, in every silence. And that's why I write to you today, so that you never be afraid to love, even if it hurts, even if it takes time, even if it seems impossible, because love is the only thing that survives time. She sealed the letter. He placed it inside his notebook and left everything on the table. Clara, upon finding it, read it through tears and smiles. And he understood, like someone receiving an ancestral secret, that story wasn't just about his mother and Tomas. It was hers too. It belonged to everyone who believes that, despite everything, love wins. Years later, that letter and all the others were organized into a small handmade book. Copies were given to grandchildren, to the city library, to the local school. And, in a short time, the story of Tomas and Emilia began to be told as one of the most beautiful love narratives the city has ever known, but not as a tragedy, like a testimony. The station bench has been restored. A small plaque was installed with a simple inscription. Here began a story that time could not erase. And so, even after the last letter, even after the last goodbye, their love remained alive. In every reader, in each letter rediscovered, in every sigh of those who believe, even in silence, that there are stories that were written to last forever. If you've made it this far, perhaps you've felt the same thing we felt when telling this story. Maybe you remembered someone, of a love that stayed, of words that were never spoken. And if this touched your heart, don't leave here like you came in. Subscribe to the channel. It's not just a click, it's a gesture from those who also believe that certain stories cannot be forgotten. Comment below. True love doesn't die, it just waits. Let's turn this sentence into an echo, a collective declaration, a reminder that real love still exists. And in the next video, you will learn about the letter that should never have been read, and which, even so, saved a life.